and what a pleasure it is to be together. And I really hope we can have a dialogue also, so I can hear what's on your mind and questions and uh, brainstorming together on the complexities of the world today, which is, in a technical term, a mess. We're really with more crises, more confusion, more disagreements than I can recall during at least my professional career, which is now 42 years of professional work in economics. Thank you for the reminiscences of 30 years ago, the start of the transformation. And I'll start back 10 years before that just for a moment, because I studied economics in the 1970s, and that was an era of stagflation as we have right now. High inflation and big shocks to output. And I thought that's a good thing to write a dissertation about. So my dissertation in 1980 was on stagflation and supply shocks. And my first book was called The Economics of Worldwide Stagflation, exactly 40 years ago this year. So I'm living a deja vu from 40 years ago because stagflation is back. So I've seen it before, and it gives me some thought. I didn't want to see it again this way. Like the stagflation of the 1970s, so many of the causes of our crisis are human-made blunders and mistakes. We've done it again, and we should really learn better from the past. And the events of 30 years ago, those early days of transformation, also continue to have a big shadow on today in ways that I didn't expect. Because after I got involved with stagflation in the early 1980s, we had a terrible economic crisis worldwide in the 1980s in the developing world and in Central and Eastern Europe, of course. Big debt crisis that came in part from the end of that stagflationary period. You'll recall that because of the high inflation in the early or maybe you won't recall, it's ancient history, but at the time of the high inflation of the late 70s and early 1980s, after some failed attempts to control the inflation, finally the United States got a new governor of our central bank, the Fed, who was 2 meters tall and smoked big cigars, Paul Volcker, and he put interest rates up to 20% in the US, which was unprecedented. Through a deep recession, ended the high inflation in the US, but created a debt crisis worldwide. That made my career, I have to say. Thank goodness for Volcker and his big cigars, because many countries started to call and say, we have a big debt crisis. And in 1985, I went to Bolivia, which had a massive debt crisis and a hyperinflation as a result of the debt crisis, very classical. And I helped them to end the hyperinflation in part by repudiating the debt. And that was an idea that I took from the 1920s and the 1930s, so it was history repeating itself. And in the 20s and 30s, the debt crises were ended in part through defaults or renegotiations or cancellations of the debts, sometimes too late, sometimes only after World War II. But in any event, I took those ideas and helped Bolivia cancel its debts, and the inflation ended. And then in early 1989, I was called by an official in the Polish embassy in Washington who came to Harvard and said, "We also have a debt crisis. Can you cancel our debt?" And it was January 1989. And I said, I have to confess, I'm really on the side of solidarity. It's under, Lech Wałęsa's under house arrest, and there's martial law. I can't really help you. And he said he understood and called me back 4 weeks later and said, we're going to eliminate martial law. Now will you come? That was not my doing. It was just the matter of timing. And so I arrived in Warsaw on April 4th, 1989, the day of the signing of the Roundtable Agreement between the government of President Jaruzelski and the Solidarity Movement. And I became an advisor to the government and to Solidarity for a couple of months, and then after the June 4 elections in Poland, to the Solidarity Movement alone. And I'll say one word about shock therapy, which is that they asked, what should we do? We're broke, we're bankrupt, it's hopeless. I said, it's easy, your debt's going to be canceled, so don't worry about the debt. And they looked at me a little bit like I was crazy, which I probably was. But I was asked to write a plan for market economy. And it was in the apartment flat of a wonderful Polish leader named Jacek Kuron, who went from jail to become the Minister of Labor, and he was a close advisor to Lech Wałęsa. And so one night, I spent about 4 hours describing my idea of what a market economy reform would look like. And he didn't speak English, I didn't speak Polish, we had a translator. There was a lot of smoke, a lot of whiskey that he was drinking. And every few minutes he'd pound on the table, tak rozumiem, tak rozumiem. I understand. And at the end of this, at about midnight, he said to me, okay, you have to write this. Now, we need this in a memo. And I said, of course, Mr. Kuron, I'm going back to the United States tomorrow night, and I will send it to you by fax, at least within 2 weeks. No, tomorrow morning. It's midnight. And so we went to a kindergarten room with the manager of the Gazeta Wyborcza, and they had a new IBM laptop, which was brand new at the time that the US had given them, and I typed a memo all night, and at 7 a.m. gave it back to Kuron. How to make a market economy. So that was my all-nighter of writing this. If anyone's interested, I'd be happy to email it to you, because many years later, someone found it in the archives and sent it to me. So I actually have a copy of that all night. And that became the basis of the Balcerowicz plan to an important extent, actually. And the idea was to make the currency convertible and open the borders to trade right away. That was the basic idea. And to back it up with two core financial steps. One was a lot of aid, and the key was something I recommended called the Polish Zloty Stabilization Fund, which was to give reserves for this new convertible currency. And the second was debt cancellation. And that theory became called the 7 postcards theory, because the night that the Mazowiecki came into power, there was a meeting of the OKP, which was the Polish, the Solidarity members of parliament. And they invited 2 speakers that night. outside speakers. One was Senator Dole, who was the US chief senator, and he was there representing President Bush, and they invited me to speak. And it worked out very well because Senator Dole spoke first and said the American people will do anything for the freedom of Poland. And then I stood up and I said, I agree with Senator Dole, and that's why I'm sure that America will cancel all of Poland's debts. And so I said, the way out of this is 7 postcards, 1 to each of the G7 countries, and tell them thank you very much, but the Soviet-era debts are gone. And in the end, Poland got about 60% of its debts canceled. The last step was Germany, because Germany was very resistant to canceling debt, as you can imagine. It took Balcerowicz, I sent Balcerowicz a copy of the 1953 London Agreement between post-Nazi Germany and the West, canceling the pre-World War II German debt. And Balcerowicz handed it to Helmut Schmidt, who looked at it in the meeting and said, you know, you have a point. Ended up, Germany supported the cancellation of the debt also. Not 100% as I wanted, 60%. So that was the origins of that. But it's worth all this reminiscing, I hope, to make a geopolitical point, which is that after that happened, I was asked by Grigory Yavlinsky, who was advisor to Gorbachev, to help President Gorbachev in 1990. And I believed that Gorbachev's idea, what he called the common European home, was exactly the right idea for Europe and for the Soviet Union. This is before the end of the Soviet Union. But Gorbachev said we should have a democratic Soviet Union, and it should be completely open, and we should have a peaceful European home, in fact, that stretches from Rotterdam to Vladivostok. I loved Gorbachev. I thought he was a man of incredible integrity and decency, basically, because he believed don't shoot people. This was his most core belief, don't shoot people. That was remarkable for a Soviet leader. It was the greatest statesmanship of the age. And so he, as you know, and Hungary led the way in every way, opening the borders and showing the different path. Gorbachev said, we will dismantle the Warsaw Pact. And it happened at the time that Helmut Kohl and Hans-Dietrich Genscher and George Bush and James Baker said, whoa, that's good. That's big. If you do that, we won't move NATO 1 inch eastward.